Today's final episode of Conversation Corner features a very special professional guest, Mrs. Marci Gray. Marci Gray is the CEO and Clinical Director of Gray Matter Health, a counseling and consulting firm based in Brampton, Ontario, Canada. With a clinical specialization in trauma, OCD, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar disorder, Marci is dedicated to improving the mental health of her clients. She leads a skilled team that provides individual, couple, group, and family therapy. In addition to her clinical work, Marci is a PhD candidate and course instructor at the University of Toronto. Her PhD research focuses on psychological health and anti-Black racism in the workplace, reflecting her commitment to fostering mental wellness in inclusive and supportive environments. Last year, Marci's dedication to mental health awareness and business excellence was recognized with 2 different prestigious awards. She is also a media guest expert, appearing regularly on programs such as CTV, City TV, and Global News. Thank you for tuning into this podcast up until this point, and please enjoy this conversation between me and Marci. I hope you find her display of wisdom and expertise just as valuable as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas, a podcast where we are speaking about ADHD, neurodivergence, media, and media versus reality, and how ADHD is often misdiagnosed in women and girls. I would like to introduce you all to our professional guest today, Marci Gray, as we transition into this conversation and get a professional perspective. Hi, Marci. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so lovely to have you because I know you personally, and my family has known you for many years. So I'm really happy that you can weigh in on this conversation from the professional side of things to give us some more insight.
Yeah, happy to weigh in.
Okay, so we're just going to get right into the conversation. So, from a professional perspective, can you briefly define attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the causes of it, and how it is classified?
Okay, so yeah, it is exactly what you said, ADHD. You just kind of laid it out in terms of attention deficit and hyperactivity. The name sometimes is deceiving, right? Because there's a lot of folks will focus on the hyperactivity side and not really the attention deficit side to it. Also
Right.
wanted to say that we used to have a differentiation between ADHD and ADD, and now we're really just calling it ADHD, whether it's the inattentive type, the hyperactive impulsive type, or the third type, which is a combination of the two. And so we're talking about this not as a mental health illness or mental illness, but more of a neurodevelopmental condition that can affect people's ability to attention regulate, to regulate impulses, to uh, really utilize their executive functioning in different ways. And so, really, it's a way of thinking about people being just different, neurodiverse, and thinking and doing things a little bit differently.
Awesome. That's a very great rundown of things. And it also makes me feel very educated and like I came prepared because a lot of what you touched on has already been mentioned in this series.
Oh,
So thank
good.
you for giving us the professional side of it. I think a lot of people are a lot more receptive to hearing things from people with credentials, but in general, it's important to make sure that we fact check ourselves by
Yeah.
people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the other part of your question in terms of the causes, I think there's been some research around genetics, the neurobiology, the early brain development of folks. So there's just different types of things that can be caused, can cause someone to have ADHD.
Right.
And I want to also emphasize, it's not bad parenting, it's not too much screen time, it's not those things that some people will blame on ADHD. And so just wanted to kind of preface that as well.
Right. Well, thank you for that. You've heard it here first, folks. Okay, so we have been talking about media a lot in this conversation. And this is a bit just of a branch off of ADHD, how people perceive it and how it's classified. I feel like when I was going through my experience of getting a diagnosis with ADHD and my post-diagnosis journey, I had a lot of people in my family and people who I called friends who kind of were influenced into these assumptions of believing that ADHD had a certain look. So I was told that I didn't seem like I had ADHD, and a lot of people were surprised that I didn't quote unquote look like I had ADHD. Could you speak to that a little bit about how certain conditions and disorders can often be not invisible, but may not present as outwardly?
Yeah. And so what does somebody with ADHD look like, right? They obviously had some kind of stereotypical idea of what ADHD. And that's the thing. A lot of people think of hyperactivity when they think of ADHD. And so maybe that's what
True.
they're thinking about when they're saying it's not something that you look like you have. And so a lot of the times it gets missed in women and girls because of that, because they're not hyperactive, disruptive, those kinds of things. And so we do need to move away from the stereotypical version of what people think hyperactivity even is, because what hyperactivity looks like in a 5-year-old may look very different in a 50-year-old or a 30-year-old, right?
Right.
So we want to kind of move away from what that actually, the stereotypes of that is. And I think that your podcast is doing that in terms of just having dialogue around this and having conversations around ADHD so people can get a better understanding of what it actually is. When you meet somebody with ADHD, you meet one person with ADHD. Everyone with
Yep.
ADHD will present and have different symptoms and have different strengths and have different challenges. And so ADHD can look very different in very different people.
I love that. That's very true. And we've been hammering home so far that ADHD is in no way a monolith. So that really does speak to that point as well. Thank you. You spoke a little bit about ADHD in childhood and what that might look like in a 5-year-old versus a 25-year-old versus a 35-year-old. And that really makes me think of how, when I reflect on my life, specifically my childhood, I found that a lot of my ADHD symptoms were a lot more hyperactive. And by the time I got diagnosed at 20, I was diagnosed with inattentive type. And I've seen a lot of changes in myself over the years that could just explain me going from being this bubbly, outgoing extrovert to being a lot more introverted and internal. But could you speak a bit to how ADHD symptoms differ in children versus in adults?
Yeah, so a lot of the times you're seeing them in children in school because teachers are having difficulty with a child, right? And so
Yeah.
now, because there's difficulty with that child, there's now the kind of wraparound supports and care and diagnosis and things like that. And a lot of times you're finding teachers having challenges with children with hyperactivity because they won't sit still. They won't sit to do an assignment. When it's quiet time, they're not quiet. They'll be disruptive. They, will ask questions and interrupt. They won't be able to do activities that are, solo and quiet. So you may see those types of behaviors and challenges in the classroom that kind of flag teachers. But on the other hand, the a lot of times you'll find that children who have the inattentive type get missed because then
Yep.
they're not disruptive, right? They are checked out sometimes, and sometimes they do okay in school and sometimes they don't, depending on what's happening with their own executive functioning. But because they're not necessarily as disruptive as the hyperactivity type, they're not necessarily noticed or recognized. So you may see those things in children in terms of being disruptive, bad behaviors, quote unquote, and disruptive behaviors in children. You don't see that in an adult the same way, right? In an adult, it may be disorganization. It may be that time blindness that they don't see. It may be, various things like needing to fidget or different things like that that doesn't get picked up by a boss as bad behavior, right? But internally, someone who is struggling with their own disorganization or the procrastination or other things, they are feeling distressed around their inability to do things like everyone else. And so
Right.
that's why sometimes it's the person who starts to flag their own doctor and starts to flag other people around them to say, I'm having difficulty, help me try to figure out why that is. Whereas you're not going to have kids come to you and say, I'm having difficulty, try to help me find out why that is. Usually it's this idea of bad behaviors that gets a child a diagnosis versus an adult.
True. And I think it's unfortunate that in children, ADHD is often just watered down to being disruptive or bad behavior because a lot of the time, children with ADHD don't have that intention. They're not as malicious as people may think or as calculated, trying to be the standout kid in class or make their teacher have a hard day. They just think differently and they operate differently and they likely need different resources and supports.
100%. 100%. That is so, so true.
Nice. I'm loving this conversation so far, and honestly loving that you're giving some insight to my own personal life and validating a lot of feelings I've had as well. So,
Good.
can you tell me a little bit about how ADHD is viewed on a more like legal scale in government, specifically the government of Canada and the municipal government of Ontario? How do
Mhm.
our governments classify ADHD? Do they acknowledge them? And what are they saying about it?
So, for the most part, it is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. And for a lot of the times when you're considering governments, you are considering whether they think it's a hot topic or not. If it's a
Right.
hot topic for the government, then they're going to put resources towards it. Just so
Okay.
happens that neurodiversity is currently a hot topic for the government.
Okay.
So they're putting some resources towards it.
Right.
So governments tend to look at things in terms of how can we service people and how can we put resources to things that we deem as important to help people. And so they do look at ADHD as the legitimate neurodevelopmental challenge, an executive functioning challenge. But they also recognize that ADHD is different for most people, and neurodiversity in and of itself is a various, like, there's so much of a spectrum in terms of neurodiversity. So I think they're seeing neurodiversity in general, with ADHD being a part of that neurodiversity. And so they're looking at, as governments, usually accessibility to treatment and healthcare and public funding to support, as well as looking at our systems and how our systems are servicing people, like our education system, our healthcare system, our legal systems, etc.
Okay. I like that you touched on how ADHD and neurodivergence seems to be a quote unquote hot topic at the moment in a time where a lot of people just have more access to education and resources. It can seem like we're in this overdiagnosis epidemic, like everyone all of a sudden has ADHD and autism, dyslexia, and things of that sort, when in reality, a lot of people are just in an era where they know more about themselves, their brains, and what they're living with, as well as the
100%.
fact that, on the other hand, we're living in a time where a lot of people are dealing with brain rot. I'm not sure if you know that
Mhm.
term, and just our addiction to our devices, doom scrolling, being chronically online, which can also present ADHD like symptoms and executive dysfunction, which is something that we actually just talked about in our last episode. So I think it's important to talk about these quote unquote hot topics and the fact that it doesn't necessarily mean that we all have it all of a sudden, but it is a topic that people are waking up to more and choosing to be educated about.
Yeah. Well, we find that when things become more mainstream, people pick it up and then they start using it as a general term. Uh,
Yes.
and so ADHD is one of those that are now people are getting more educated about. It's not to the point where they're using it in everyday language, but it's to the point where everybody may think they may have like a trait that might be ADHD. Uh,
Right.
Not everyone, but I'll give you examples, right? Like people who like things neat are going to say, "Oh, I'm so OCD," or
Right.
people who don't like how people are behaving will say they're so narcissistic. So when people start to get more familiar with terms, they start to use it in everyday language.
Right.
And so sometimes it gets thrown around, but I think that's one of the challenges to us becoming more aware without education.
Right. kind of turning serious medical conditions into like buzzwords.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah, we are seeing a lot of that. And maybe it's what comes with the rise of education in these hot topics. But I hope that it levels out over time and
Well,
people
there's a difference
understand the
between
difference.
awareness and education, right? I think awareness allows us to understand the term in sometimes stereotypical way, right? Because some people are learning about AHE from TikTok, and that might
Yes.
not be education, it just might be entertainment. And so there's an awareness, but not necessarily an education. And so that's the thing. There's a difference. There's a huge difference between just awareness and education.
Gotcha. I like that point because a lot of us might think we are so educated on a topic that we can speak on it, but it's really about putting the hours and time and doing the proper research to get the correct information that
Exactly.
differentiates education from awareness, like you said.
Exactly.
Great point. Okay. So I'm very curious about the ADHD diagnosis process. I've been through my own process now. As of November 2025, it's been 3 years since I've been diagnosed with ADHD. And my entire life has changed with this new information. And I've kind of had to reshape my world and rewire my brain. But I would love for you as a professional to kind of walk us through the ADHD diagnosis process. And also, maybe you can explain a bit why it feels like a lot of people experience very long waiting times trying to get a diagnosis in Canada.
It's so, so long in terms of wait times. And that's because we have a limited number of people who can, one of the reasons is because we have a limited number of people who actually have the license to diagnose. So
Yes.
even though I'm a clinician and I can work with those with ADHD and I've been trained and all of the things, all clinicians can't diagnose. And so that's the challenge.
Okay.
You have to be a psychiatrist, or a medical doctor or a psychologist in order to give a formal diagnosis. So it's challenging because that means that some of us are not licensed to diagnose, which then makes it difficult in terms of wait lists, right? But
Yeah.
the other challenge is when you're like, not all doctors do the diagnosis as well, and and it's preferable that a psychologist do it. Again, there's limited number of psychologists available, and also another big deterrent is the cost.
True.
If you're going to a psychologist to get a diagnosis, the cost can be quite astronomical. Thousands of dollars in order to get the assessment done, for example. There are some free services available that are, a lot of times have wait lists. And so that's again another challenge in Ontario. Also, there's some new apps and things that are helping people to get quicker diagnosis.
Oh, really?
I can't speak to the validity of those apps. But there are some new apps out there that are helping people get diagnosis for maybe under $1,000. But again, I can't speak to the validity of those apps and how well they actually diagnose. The process of diagnosis is, a lot of times and you probably have your own example of what you went through, but there's a clinical interview, you're looking at your medical and developmental history, there's questionnaires that you're going to complete. Sometimes it's a full psychoeducational assessment. Sometimes you're getting input around like your report cards or your teacher's notes, or um, listening or finding out other information gathering like that. And so it is a quite thorough process because you're usually getting tested for neurodiversity in general, in addition to ADHD, or you can specifically just be looking at ADHD.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's a process, and it's sometimes really difficult, and a lot of times finances are determined. Did you have to, for yourself, in terms of your example, how was it for you in getting that diagnosis?
Honestly, I started with my primary physician. I spoke to my family doctor and I basically just brought my concerns to her. It was not originally met with a response I was expecting. She kind of gave me a bit of a dismissive response based on the fact that I did well in school as a child. And she kind of used that stereotype against me. But I was really serious about getting this diagnosis at this time because I had been struggling for a while and I was in university. So I was very particular about advocating for a second opinion, to which she put in a referral to a professional, a psychiatrist, I believe, or a psychologist, either one of the two, maybe both. I believe he was a psychiatrist in the greater Toronto area. And after about 8 months from the time I had that call to the time I got a call, um, that's about the time I had to wait to hear from that psychiatrist, plan the scheduled appointment, and after that, it was maybe about 3 months out for me to actually go in person and do my test. So I think I'm a bit privileged in the sense that that's still kind of a short period of time in the grand scheme of things. There's a lot of stories that are much longer in waiting time. So I'm very grateful for that, as well as the fact that I was diagnosed at 20, and that's fairly young for women.
Yeah, it is. So yeah, and you're right in terms of a lot of times in the school system, you don't get even that diagnosis unless you're a bad child
Right.
with bad behavior that
Yeah.
terrible, or your
Yeah.
grades like horrendous. And that's
Yeah.
why so many people can go through the school system without being diagnosed, right? And so that's the thing. But girls, especially girls and women, identified folks with ADHD can make it through the school systems a lot of the time, because you learn as a girl a lot of times what good behavior looks like, and you try to have that good behavior and
Right.
work on your grades as much as possible. Doesn't mean that you're not struggling, but a lot of times it's internalized and you're not letting people know what the struggles are, and everyone thinks you're good because you're doing good in school.
That's very true. And those are things that we have also touched on here, as well as intersectionality and
Hmm.
how one's background, ethnic background, cultural upbringing, and even faith can play roles in how we view these things
Hmm.
and prolong um, a possible diagnosis for each individual.
Hmm.
So I've been speaking a lot on that because obviously it's no secret that I'm a black woman, you're a black woman.
Hmm.
And at a point, I was a black girl, and just the way that black girls are seen in society, the way that we are kind of adultified in society, even sexualized, and just viewed differently, really affects our worldview. So thank you for speaking on women and girls and how things can be very different for us.
Absolutely. And culturally, I don't know if you've already spoken about that, but culturally as well, whether you're Caribbean or African descent, as a black person, a lot of cultural influences impact whether you can say that you are struggling or not, right?
Very true.
Or you may tell your parents that you're having difficulty, but you're not having bad grades. So or they tell you just to work harder, study harder, not do you that kind of thing.
Yeah, we've all heard the different comments and tropes, and unfortunately, a lot of our parents are a product of their generation and their environment. But at a certain point, it does become a responsibility of theirs to look out for their children and
Mhm.
understand that things change and times change.
Right.
Awesome. So, on the topic of diagnosis, I want to talk a little bit about self diagnosis because I believe that that's where part of my journey started. I've told the story about my journey, almost my whole life journey, but mainly my journey to diagnosis on here. And I've also had my parents on here talking about their perspective of me as a child growing up. And when I was around the age of 11 or 12, that's when I kind of started to go down the rabbit hole of ADHD research and those little online quizzes and things of that sort. And I had just this very strong feeling that I was living with ADHD, almost like an inner knowing. And that is around the time I started to self diagnose. But I would say by the time I was maybe 16, I was fully self diagnosed with intention to get professionally diagnosed. I did not want to just be self diagnosed and leave it at that. My question for you is, how do you feel about self diagnosis? And do you believe that it is a valid form of the diagnosis process?
Okay. So remember, you are talking to me as as a professional. So let me
Of
say,
course. But also, I feel comfortable enough to be honest with you.
yeah. So generally speaking, people will self-diagnose and that's the challenge for us as mental health practitioners. People will come to us saying, "I have a OCD." How do you know? Because they Googled it and they know. Or I
Right.
have, what, ADHD. How do you know? I Googled it. I know. And
Yeah.
this whole self-diagnosis can be helpful. But again, I want to differentiate between self-awareness and self-diagnosis, right? I
Okay.
think self-awareness is very important because that's what's going to bring you to a professional to get help.
Okay.
Self-diagnosis can be dangerous because you are not sure, but you think, right? I think you need to
Yes.
have a self-awareness because I think you need to understand something's going on for me that isn't everyone doesn't see, but I see. That is really important.
Okay.
100% very important. To self-diagnose can be dangerous because you don't know for sure if that's what you have, but you think that's what you have. So I would steer away from like a self-diagnosis and I would 100% be behind a self-awareness. Now, self-diagnosis to self-awareness to me is these are the things that I'm struggling with. I'm going to look it up. I'm going to be more aware and it may fit for me. And I find this diagnosis fits for what I'm feeling and that can be like amazing because now it validates all that I'm feeling. I'm not losing it. I'm not making this up in my head. This is a real thing. That can be validating and important and it's an important step towards getting a diagnosis. Now,
Yes.
is self-diagnosis illegitimate? It's not illegitimate. I can say it could be dangerous because you can diagnose yourself with something that you don't actually have, just that you think you have, and then behave as if you have it. And in some cases, that can be dangerous and that can be, again, I think the self-awareness piece is what's more helpful, right?
Right.
Um, and so it's not as dangerous maybe with something with ADHD. It might be more dangerous with other types of mental health conditions and disorders, right? Um, but I think self-awareness is 100% important. Self-diagnosis, I guess what I think of it as is that you take that in as this is my diagnosis 100%. And the
Yeah.
thing is with ADHD, the reason why that can be challenging is that ADHD a lot of the time can mask itself as other things. And a lot of the time when you have ADHD, you can have other dual diagnosis. So there
True.
could be so many other things that you want to be aware of. And so that's why I say getting a formal diagnosis will be helpful. A full assessment would be helpful so that you know, is this just ADHD or is this ADHD and a learning disability? Is this ADHD and anxiety? Is this ADHD and depression? Is this ADHD and something else, right? Getting a full diagnosis gives you the full picture so that you can understand how, again, I need to help myself and how others can help me, whether it's through work or through school or other areas. How can I help myself and how can others help me? Going to a practitioner like myself saying this is what I have as a diagnosis from a clinician. I still look at it and I still do my own assessments, but I also look at I'll look at that as okay, you've been assessed and like I also want to know, was it a well-rounded assessment for everything or was it just for ADHD? Um that makes a difference as well, right? Because if you have a full assessment where they're assessing do you have other diagnosis that could be overlapping, that's also important. The other thing is we haven't, trauma in some people's lives can also present as ADHD symptoms as well. And so we
Okay.
want to make sure it's not trauma that is manifesting itself. It's definitely ADHD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I like that differentiation between self-awareness and self-diagnosis. It makes me question now what I was doing. I don't think that I was so
I think
matter-of-factly sure.
self-awareness is 100% what you
Yeah,
need to get yourself to the help that you need.
I
Right?
agree
Some
with that.
people will sit at self-diagnosis and then they won't get the help they need because I've
Right.
diagnosed myself and I already know this is what it is, and then they move forward with that. I think the diagnosis, getting a formal diagnosis, will also help you to understand what you formally need for support.
Very true. And at the time when I was assessing myself and just feeling like I was in alignment with a lot of these symptoms and experiences, I believe that I was in a state where I was obviously looking for answers, but not so sure of myself that I was definitive and ready to just stop there. So I'm glad that I still advocated for myself beyond that and got the correct professional answers.
Yeah, because what you're saying to me is around 10, 11, you became self-aware that something's
Yep.
different, or something is that something I need to research something. And that's when you started to look into that. So that self-awareness is huge. It's 100% the beginning of understanding what is happening for me that other people can't see, that I know is happening inside.
Yes. Great. Thank you for that. Next question is, can you highlight the treatment options for people with ADHD and how each method works?
Mhm. Yeah, so there's different types of professionals who offer treatment. So there is someone like me, a clinician, who does all kinds of mental health treatment, but also has specialization in ADHD. So that's a clinician, a psychotherapist who can help you through ADHD. There also is people who are not like clinically licensed, but they have a coaching. They've been trained in ADHD coaching, and that's also helpful to have a coach who specializes in ADHD. The other types of treatment are medications. So medications can be very, very important. There's so much negativity around medications for mental health or neurodiversity, and there ought not to be. Medications, whether stimulants or non-stimulants or different medication types, can be very helpful in the treatment of ADHD. And so I don't want to diminish that as one of the important aspects of ADHD treatment. In addition to medication, there are a lot of now there's a huge field of natural remedies and natural, like the naturopathic positioning as well when it comes to ADHD. And in that, lifestyle changes, health, nutrition, sleep, mindfulness, those things are a part of that as well.
Yep.
And then there's treatment through other types of case management professionals, such as at schools. There might be case management professionals that are versed in ADHD who can offer support in like a school environment, for example, um,
Lovely.
as well as counselors in schools.
Right. That's awesome. And it's important to note that not every treatment works for each individual. And sometimes it takes some trial and error to see which one is for you.
Exactly. Exactly.
Nice. Okay. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. I will ask you any other personal questions I have on my own time because
Okay.
now I'm
So you
curious.
don't, those other two questions you don't want
But
to ask?
no, I'm going to ask you a last one.
Okay.
Yeah. So our last one is, can you leave us with some advice on how we can all focus on maintaining our cognitive and mental health, regardless of if we're neurodivergent people or neurotypical people?
Hmm. Yeah, so in terms of maintaining your mental health, you want to pay attention to some major things like how you're sleeping, how you're eating, how you're generally functioning every day. A lot of the times, our eating, our sleeping, and our functioning will go out of whack and we're not paying attention to it. We're just trying to push forward, do our thing. And those are some major key indicators that you need to pay attention to your mental health. If you're looking at your thoughts, how are your thoughts? Are your thoughts clear? Are they negative? Are they dark? Are you thinking of thoughts of suicide, not being here anymore? Those kinds of things. That is a highlight to look after your mental health. And you want to look at your stress and burnout levels as well, and be taking care of those things in terms of like looking at flags in terms of your mental health. But in general, your mental health should be thought of just like your physical health. You go for a checkup in your physical health, go for a checkup for your mental health. Always be proactive. Don't wait until you're in a crisis or in a negative situation to look after your mental health. You can always, always look after your mental health and wellness.
Lovely. I love that. Thank you so much for today's conversation. Thank you for being honest and open and willing to have this conversation with me. It has meant the world to me. Just to have people in my life who are willing to contribute to my projects and ideas and to help me learn something new about myself. I really hope that this reaches the people who need to hear it. And I hope that we both are able to change some minds, maybe change some lives, get people thinking more about moving from that awareness to education.
Well, thank you for bravely sharing your story and yourself with everyone. I think your listeners will be fascinated to hear your journey and to hear your story. And I appreciate that you're doing this project. I think this is great in terms of building awareness and education for folks.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Marci. It's been great, and we appreciate you. This podcast was created for education and entertainment purposes only. All included content is 100% the personal opinions, experiences, and research of Kimberly Douglas. Thank you for tuning into Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas. Until next time, stay educated, think critically, and question everything.